Hey, I just want to make a quick video about motorcycle suspension. I see a lot of confusion um, in this, and I know there's a lot of people who have a really high level understanding. And a lot of people seem really confused that I see online about what any of the parts do or why you would want to change them out or how that would affect your ride or your motorcycle. So I just kind of wanted to make a little bit of a translation video in between, which I don't see a lot of. So this is a Showa fork. This particular one's out of a VTX 1800, but they're pretty similar components for the Showa stuff for sport bikes and cruisers and naked bikes and all sorts of stuff. And it's a pretty common setup you're looking at here. There's some variations, but it's pretty much like these parts with maybe slight differences. So the first thing that we're looking at is springs. Springs, the easiest way to think about it for me is springs control your vehicle. Without springs, you wouldn't have the spring tension to hold your suspension apart. Anytime you hit even the tiniest bump on the road, you would be smashing hard parts together, your suspension would be collapsed, you'd be bottoming out. So springs control the vehicle. Springs come in spring rates. It's easier to explain because this is a linear spring, which we'll get into a little bit more. So springs are rated in a distance per unit of force. So for instance, this spring takes 1 kilogram of force to move it 1 millimeter. This is important because the linear spring like this, nothing can change this spring rate. Unless this spring is damaged, it will stay this rate. When we're talking about spring preload, when we're looking at this, if we compress this 1 millimeter, that'll take 1 kilogram. If we compress it 2 millimeters, that'll take 2 kilograms of force. This spring is longer than the travel of our suspension. We're talking about a cruiser here that has probably a 5 or 6 inch suspension travel, and this is a spring that has maybe 10 inches of travel. To compress this all the way, it would probably be somewhere between 8 and 10 inches. So we can make use of different parts of this spring. We'll use some easy math. We'll pretend this spring is 200 millimeters long and that we have 100 millimeters of suspension travel. So if we didn't have any spring preload, to go from all the way up on our suspension all the way down would take 100 kilograms of force, right? Because we have 100 millimeters of suspension travel, 100 kilograms of force to compress that. Now, since our spring is twice, in this example, the length of our suspension travel, we can use a different portion of the spring if we like. If we put 100 millimeters of preload onto this spring, that means it's going to start, instead of at 1 kilogram of force to compress the first millimeter, it's going to take 101 kilograms of force to compress the first millimeter and then go up from there in a linear fashion. So preload doesn't change the rate of this spring. All it's doing is changing which portion of the spring we're using. So really, changing to the correct springs is always better, but for fine-tuning or for temporary things, preload is easier. So that's it about spring preload. Damping is to control springs. Springs control the vehicle, damping controls the springs. Like I said, so if we're talking about a spring and we're compressed and we're looking at rebound damping when the spring returns, what we really want is for the spring not to do this. We don't want it to slam out and then bounce back and forth, and we don't want the compression to be the rebound damping to be so tight that it's removing so much energy from the spring that it goes really slowly. Because then if we hit successive bumps, we would collapse further and further and further and further before it could return. So optimally with rebound damping, what we will want is for it to return quickly and stop. So that's it. That's the whole goal of rebound damping. Once this is on your bike, that's why you see those videos of the guys who are like grabbing the bike and they push it down real hard and release, and what they're looking for is for it to pop back up quickly and stop. They don't want to see it go. They just want to see it pop back up, and then it's ready to take the next impact, to recover from the next impact. Compression damping is a little harder to set up because rebound damping is really only dealing with the unsprung mass and your spring itself, how fast the spring is returning, the wheel, the suspension, stuff like that. Those don't really change regularly. Compression damping is when the spring is collapsing, how fast it's allowing that to happen. That can change based on rider weight, accessories, things you have on your bike, passengers, luggage, all sorts of things. So that changes more and it's harder to set up, but it's also not as important. As long as you're in the ballpark and you're not collapsing way too quickly and bottoming out or something like that, and really, you shouldn't be relying on compression damping to keep from bottoming out. That should be a spring thing, but sometimes if you hit a really bad bump, a big bump at high speed, the damping can help with that some. But mostly it should be your spring supporting your vehicle. So anyway, how they do this is normally this would be sitting inside this fork that's filled with fork oil. And there's two pistons in here. Normally there's a little ring around the bottom right here. This looks like a little clip. I used to have one over here. Oh, now I got two. So there's a little clip, sits right in here. You push this piston up just a little bit, and you remove the clip, just a little small flat blade screwdriver or something, and then you pop this, and this is the compression piston. There we go. And this is the rebound damping piston. So the way this works is it sits right in here, and fluid flows through this valve. And if you look, there's a little washer right here. This washer deflects, so as fluid is trying to be forced through this valve, that washer there, it is providing tension against the holes to keep the fluid from flowing down, or slow down the fluid from flowing out. Wow, I can't speak apparently. So as you could imagine, in order to increase the damping, the compression damping for this piston, if we increase the stacks of this washer right here, it would have more compression damping. It would be harder for that fluid to flow through. So since this is a non-adjustable cruiser suspension, that's really the only way that doing this that we could increase just the compression damping. The rebound damping is the same way. Again, we have a little nut here. This may or may not be peened over. So a lot of times what you would do is grind the peening off if you did so, if you wanted to adjust this, and then you would add more washers over here. More washers would increase, I'm sorry, right here. This is kind of the input side. That's where it's flowing in. So it just flops back and forth. But the actual high tension side is over here. Right? So you could take off this nut, you could add more of those deflection washers in there, and every washer you added, thicker washers would add more, more rebound damping. Thinner washers would add less, or removing washers. So that's it. You would just adjust those washer stacks to adjust how much, if you wanted to adjust these independently. If you just wanted to do overall adjustments to both, you wanted more compression and rebound damping, you could just increase the fork weight oil. There are some disadvantages to that, but it's a relatively easy thing to do. So let's see, I think that's pretty much it as far as the basics go. So for sport bikes, this is actually a compression piston for a sport bike. Just a second here. And here is a rebound piston for a sport bike. So as you can see, they're very, very similar. In this particular case, this is an aluminum rod. It's hollow. And it's sort of hard to see. I don't know if you can see it with my desk in the way. But these in the center are hollow on the sport bike versions because they have adjustable suspension. They also have many more washers stacked up there. This washer stack is a lot thicker. So it's much harder for fluid to flow past the washers. However, there's this big hole in the middle. So the way this works is the hole is for the adjustable suspension. So on your fork cap, you have a rod like this that comes down and it slides into, trying to do that on camera was difficult. But as it screws down, it's obstructing that orifice. This tapered cone shoves further in and allows less and less fluid by. So you're adding enough of washer stack here that it's making it really hard, and then you're adjusting with that rod how much fluid you want to flow by, and that's how you get adjustable suspension. On Hondas, particularly, a lot of Honda Cruisers, Goldwings, Valkyries, like I said, this is a VTX 1800. I think Shadows and Furies do it too. They'll have all this action in one fork, and then they'll just have what's called a damper, and this is called a damper cartridge. I sometimes mix those up without meaning to. This is called a damper rod. Sometimes these damper rods will be hollow with holes on the outside, but they're really the same sort of idea. So this is a very, very rudimentary damping thing that can only do compression damping. And unlike the deflection washers, where the more pressure you have behind them, the more they can deflect and allow fluid through, this is a very fixed orifice size. It can only flow through so much fluid over time. I think the reasoning for this is when they're trying to make these suspensions for cruisers and touring bikes like the Goldwing and make them relatively soft, you can't ever allow suspension to bottom out. Really, that's the worst possible thing. If it bottoms out, you're losing control of your bike. It's going to go very, very badly. So if you have Goldwings that have relatively soft suspension, especially for their weight, and they're traveling down the freeway doing 80 miles an hour and a board falls out of the truck in front of them and they hit a 2x4 going 80 miles an hour, a 4x4 or something massive, and suddenly their suspension very quickly compresses, this type of relatively open damping is going to really restrict how fast fluid can flow through at those high rates. So I think this is just really for cutting down on suspension bottoming out for high-speed damping events. That's all I can figure anyway. I think that's what's going on with these because they are very rudimentary, and the openings are so large that at low speeds, when the springs are compressing, and I don't mean low vehicle speeds, I mean low spring speeds. So if the springs are compressing and moving back and forth at a relatively slow rate, this really isn't going to do anything with holes this big. But if it's suddenly smashed, it can restrict that fluid, and I think to keep it from bottoming out. And the last thing I think we want to talk about is springs. So this is a stock Goldwing spring. You can springs of the same wire winding, the closer together they're wound, the softer rate they are, and the further apart they're wound, the harder rate they are. So if I was to squeeze this spring, it's kind of hard to see, but the left side collapses first. It's the softer portion. This is a compromise. This is a hard compromise because this spring, a Goldwing spring, I'm going off memory, but I want to say this is 0.7 kilograms per millimeter, and this is 1.6. So for perspective, I said this was 1 earlier, but it's actually not. It's actually 1.2. So this is a really stiff motorcycle spring. So this is 1.2 the whole way down the spring. So it's actually firmer than the soft portion of the Goldwing, but it's a lot softer than the firm portion of the Goldwing. And that's kind of what you need when you're trying to do this, is the more of your suspension you're dedicating towards the soft side of the spring, the harder your hard side of the spring is going to have to take up the slack at near bottoming out your compression to keep you from bottoming out. And also, with the way things work with preload, you're going to be using this area primarily first, because when you're pressing on it, that's the softer portion, so it's going to collapse first. More of it's going to collapse first, and then when you've got sag going on, same thing, that's going to collapse first, and it's going to use a greater portion of your suspension because it's softer of your suspension travel. So if you notice, there's not a whole lot of transition here. We have the thinner springs and the thinner springs and the thinner springs, and then we suddenly go to these wider space springs. There's sort of one coil in between that is kind of a transition coil, but this is a pretty hard transition. So if you hit a big bump on your Goldwing, and Honda does this, and a lot of manufacturers do this, you're going to feel almost like you're bottoming out when it's transitioning between these points. So you're going to get this very strong jarring sensation as it goes from this really, really supple, soft portion to this really, really hard portion. Whereas this, a linear spring, is going to be linear. And the whole way, it's, like I said, it compresses in a linear fashion. There's not going to be any hard transition going on. I'm not really a big fan of the progressive style of springs. I think there's kind of too many compromises going on, and I feel like they exist because of reviewers who are not very knowledgeable in how things work. When you get a reviewer who goes, "Oh yeah, that bike handle's great, but I can feel every little tiny bump." Well, yeah, but are you losing control? Are the small bumps causing your bike to be jarred and you're losing control? Like, you should be able to feel bumps on a sport bike. And then on the other side, they get these cruisers where they're like, I don't want to feel anything at all. I just want to be complete mushy, soft stuff. But then they wallow through corners and you're going, yeah, the problem is you don't understand how springs work. If you want a soft spring, it's going to wallow in corners, but it's going to be really easy. It's going to soak up bumps easier. So it's for these people who don't, I think, really understand what's going on, that these exist. And they're kind of, some people like them, but to me, they're kind of a lot of compromises that don't make a lot of sense. I would much rather have a predictably handling bike. And for me, I prefer performance. So I would say, hey, I'm not crazy sport bike performance, but I like even my cruisers to handle well. So feeling bumps isn't a problem. Yeah, you don't want your teeth to be jarring every time you feel them. And on the other hand, you don't want to transition in a spring so hard that it compresses your spine every time you go across a bump. I would rather have a bike that handles in a predictable fashion rather than things. So anyway, that's my soapbox. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or, tell me what you would have liked to see in this video, and maybe I'll make another one. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.